Robert was born in a city where mornings began the same way. The honk of a factory, footsteps in the courtyard, the smell of cheap bread from a bakery on the corner. The bread was stale by the evening, but it was there, and it was enough for people to believe in the order of things. His father returned from work with gray hands and tired eyes. His mother poured soup diluted with water and said it was healthier that way. Robert ate slowly, memorizing the warmth of the plate and the rare feeling of calm. The end of the 20s brought a strange silence. At first, the conversations disappeared. Then laughter. They began to throw up their hands more often in stores and to close the gates in warehouses. People talked about norms and plans in whispers, as if words could hurt. Robert saw how his mother began to cut bread thinner than paper and always save the last piece for tomorrow. Just in case, she said, and there was more fear than concern in those words. Sugar disappeared first, then the cereals. Meat became a memory, like a holiday that once was, but no one remembered its date. My father started bringing home news instead of food, where the store was closed, who was removed from office, where the grain went. These news couldn't be verified. They could only be swallowed and kept silent. One day, Robert noticed that the smell of bread had disappeared completely, not from the bakery, but from the city. He walked down the street and felt only cold and dust. In the evening, my mother stood at the stove for a long time, looking into an empty pot, as if she expected the food to appear on its own. Robert asked if there would be cabbage soup tomorrow. The mother smiled and said, "They will." He realized that a smile is a new currency. No one said the word hunger. They were afraid of him. But it already lived in every house, in every stomach, in every look. It wasn't beating yet. It was just breathing nearby. And Robert felt for the first time that his usual life had cracked like ice in spring. Slowly, quietly, irreversibly. Hunger became noticeable not by the empty plates. They got used to them quickly, but by the cues. They grew like shadows at sunset. People went out after dark, put stools, bricks, bundles of rags to mark their place, and went to warm themselves in the entrances. We returned by dawn and found that the queue had already shifted, and with it, hope. Robert stood for 8 hours for the first time, then 10, then 12. My legs were numb, my stomach felt empty, and my head was spinning from the smells that were no longer there. When the store's doors finally opened, the inside was just as empty as the outside. The saleswomen spread their hands, looked at the floor, and repeated the same word. Nothing. Sometimes bread was brought. Then the queue would shudder like a living thing. People clung to each other, argued, screamed, fell. Robert saw the man clinging to the bag of loaves like a lifeline. They hit him on the arms, on the back, but he wouldn't let go. When the bag burst, the bread scattered in the mud, and people picked it up from the ground without shaking it off. One day, Robert returned home without bread. The mother listened in silence, nodded, and took out the last biscuit from the drawer. She broke it into 3 pieces. She didn't keep anything for herself. "I ate in the cafeteria," she said without looking at me. Robert realized that lying had become a form of caring. My father was increasingly late at work, not because they paid more, they paid less later, but because the factory sometimes gave a mess. He brought home the smell of smoke and boiling water, which seemed almost festive. The family sat in silence, listening to their own chewing, as if they were afraid to scare off a rare moment of satiety. Hughes taught people patience and cruelty at the same time. Robert remembered the faces, blank, pointed, identical. He realized that hunger is not a lack of food. It's an expectation that eats up a person faster than an empty stomach. When money ceased to mean anything, the city invented another language, the language of exchange. It was short and brutal. The words in it were superfluous, the looks were decisive. Robert realized this when he saw a neighbor in a communal apartment take off her wedding ring and put it in the palm of a stranger's hand. In return, she received a bundle of flour, so small that it could be hidden in her pocket. She hugged him to her chest as if she had regained a part of her life. The market appeared on its own, without signage and rules. In courtyards, under stairs, at fences. Everything was exchanged there. Watches for potato peelings, coats for a handful of cereals, books for a piece of bread. Things lost their history and gained weight, the weight of days spent. Robert carried his father's belt, carefully folded so that the leather would not crack. He knew they wouldn't give much for the belt, but it would be enough for the family to survive until morning. He stood without looking up. Other people's hands were feeling the belt, checking the buckle, stalling for time. Then someone nodded and held out a package. Inside was flour mixed with husks and sand. Robert didn't bother to check. He realized that discernment is a luxury. At home, the mother silently accepted the package. She didn't ask where he was from. That evening they cooked a thick, almost festive stew. They ate slowly, fearing that the food would disappear if they hurried. The father looked at the empty strap on the nail and said nothing. The exchange was getting harder every day. People began to bargain not for things, but for time. For how many days? They asked. And this question was scarier than any other. Robert saw how the city was learning to count life in portions. He realized that hunger doesn't just take away food. He changes the measure of everything. Hunger hit those who couldn't understand it the hardest. The children did not know what it meant to be patient or wait. They were just getting weaker. Robert noticed this in the courtyard. It had always been noisy here before, shouting, running, laughing. Now the children were sitting against the walls, leaning their backs against the cold brick and staring at one point. They didn't ask for food anymore. The requests required strength. The neighborhood mothers tried to joke at first. They said that the children were just tired, that spring was coming, that it would get easier soon. But their voices were shaking. Robert saw a woman rocking a baby all day without changing her position. In the evening, she still sat there, clutching him to her chest. Only then did it become clear. She was already rocking silence. For the first time, Robert helped carry out the body in silence. He was wrapped in an old sheet, too big for his small body. It was light, frighteningly light. The two men carried him, trying not to look at each other. No one was crying in the courtyard. Crying required strength, but there was no more strength. After that, the children started disappearing more often. Someone died at home, someone died on the way to get food, someone just stopped getting up. Robert saw how the mothers changed. Their faces became stony, their movements slow, their eyes empty. They no longer asked why. They asked when. Robert began to be afraid of silence. She became too dense, too heavy. Previously, silence meant peace. Now, the absence of life. He walked past the courtyard and found himself waiting for a scream, crying, at least some kind of sound. But the city was silent. At that time, Robert realized one thing. Hunger is not just about food. It's about the disappearance of the future. When children die, time dies. And the city began to live without tomorrow. When the food finally ran out, people started looking for it where previously they had only been looking for work or firewood. The earth is no longer just the earth. She became the last reserve. Robert saw people going out in the courtyards in the morning with shovels and knives, as if on a quiet, shameful hunt. They didn't look at each other. Shame was stronger than hunger, but hunger was winning. They ate the bark first. It was stripped from young trees in thin strips, dried at furnaces, and ground into powder. Then the roots. They had to be dug deep because the top layer had already been burned away by hands and feet. Robert was digging with the others. The ground was frozen, hard, as if it was resisting. The nails were breaking, the fingers were bleeding, but no one stopped. The pain was understandable. Hunger is not. In the evenings, strange soups were cooked in the houses. Water, grass, bark, sometimes a handful of flour if you're lucky. This soup did not saturate, but it deceived the body for several hours. Robert ate slowly, trying not to breathe deeply. The smell was heavy, earthy, and it ate into clothes and memories. He realized that this smell would stay with him forever. Sometimes people got sick from such food. They vomited and lost consciousness, but the next day they went back to digging. There was no choice. The city no longer asked if it was possible to live like this. He asked if you want to die today or try to live until tomorrow. Robert noticed how his body was changing. He became lighter, his movements became slower, and his thoughts became shorter. Everything superfluous disappeared. There was only one wish left, that the next day would come. During this period, for the first time, he was afraid not of death, but of the emptiness inside himself. The one that remained when even the fear was dulled. The earth had a taste. Bitter, cold, desperate. Robert realized that when a person starts eating earth, he has already crossed the line. There's no turning back. There is only forward movement, even if it leads along the edge. At first, death was scary. Then she surprised me. And then it became the background, like the weather. Robert noticed that people began to walk around the bodies on the streets as habitually as puddles. Someone stopped for a second, someone didn't. No one asked what happened. The answer was too obvious. The bodies appeared in the morning. Sometimes they were found at the entrances, sometimes right in the queues. People fell quietly, without screaming. I didn't have the strength to scream. Robert saw a man who sat down to rest against the wall of the store and did not get up again. The queue closed like water. A few hours later, he was covered with newspapers. Newspapers have become a universal blanket. The dead were wrapped in them. The cracks in the windows were plugged, and the last pieces of bread were cut on them. Yesterday's slogans and news turned into shrouds. Robert read the headlines before turning away. He didn't know why. Perhaps he wanted to make sure that the world was still writing about life. Funerals have almost completely disappeared. Sometimes a few people dug a shallow hole outside the city. Sometimes the bodies were simply taken away on carts. Sometimes they didn't take him away at all. Robert realized that death also has norms, and they change faster than the laws. The worst part was getting used to it. Robert caught himself thinking that he was passing by and didn't feel anything. No horror, no pity, just fatigue. It scared him more than any corpse. He realized that if his feelings disappeared, he himself would disappear, even if his body was still moving. In the evenings, the houses became quieter than ever. Not because people were asleep, but because everyone was listening to the breathing nearby. If breathing became too rare, too quiet, it was noticed. But we couldn't always do something. One day, Robert woke up with a strange thought. Death no longer seemed to be the end. It seemed like a stop. Rest. He sat up in bed, and for a long time could not figure out whether he was afraid of this thought or envious of it. When hunger became habitual, another fear came to the city, the fear of talking. He was quieter and more dangerous. People have learned to lower their voices even when they are alone. The words seemed as heavy as stones. If you drop them, they can hear you. Robert noticed that conversations in the communal apartment were cut off as soon as someone entered. Even the greetings became short and cautious. The disappearances occurred without explanation. Yesterday the man was standing in line. Today his place was empty. I couldn't ask. The questions made it noticeable. Robert saw a neighbor being taken away at night, without shouting, without resistance. In the morning, a bed and a cup with dried traces of chowder were left in the room. No one asked where he had gone. Everyone understood. Questions are a luxury. At home, Robert spoke in a whisper. Even when I was alone, the walls seemed too thin, and the silence seemed too attentive. He found himself choosing his words as if he were writing a letter that anyone could read. Sometimes he didn't speak at all, because silence had become the safest language. People were more afraid to complain than to die. A complaint could lead to disappearance, and death was already nearby and understandable. Robert saw how the mother in the queue kept her words when she was not given enough. She just nodded and walked away. Later, she fainted on the street, but she never said a word. The city lived differently at night. The footsteps sounded louder than during the day. Every creak of the door made me shudder. Robert lay awake and listened to the neighbors breathing. He understood. Fear binds people more tightly than hunger. Hunger destroys bodies. Fear destroys trust. At that time, Robert realized that survival is not just about food. It's about the ability to disappear in plain sight. Be quieter, smaller, more inconspicuous. He's learned that. And every day he felt a part of himself disappearing along with his voice. Robert left early in the morning, as usual, without breakfast and without words. The house was still breathing. Floorboards creaked, water dripped somewhere, and someone coughed behind the wall. He remembered that sound because he would never hear it again. Returning in the evening, Robert immediately realized that something was wrong. The silence was different. Not at night, not careful, empty. The door to the room was ajar. There was no mother or father inside. The bed was neatly made, as if no one had gotten up. There is a cold pot of muddy water on the table. There's an empty nail in the corner where my father's jacket used to hang. Robert stood and waited for an explanation, even though he knew there would be no explanation. He went out into the courtyard. The neighbors turned away. Someone pretended not to notice him. Someone was shrugging his shoulders. One woman said softly, "They were taken away in the morning." She didn't know where to go, or she didn't want to know. Robert nodded, as if this was a normal conversation about the weather. He returned to the room and sat on the edge of the bed. The house was no longer a home. It has become a place where people once lived. Robert tried to remember his mother's voice, the smell of his father's clothes, the sound of footsteps. The memories disintegrated as if they were being eaten from the inside. He didn't cry that night. Crying meant acknowledging a loss, and the confession made it final. He just sat and stared into the darkness, counting his breaths. Every breath was proof that he was still here. Every exhale means they're gone. In the morning, Robert realized that he was alone now. Hunger, fear, death, it all became personal. There was no one to share the rations, no one to lie about being full, no one to listen to at night. The emptiness in the room coincided with the emptiness inside. He closed the door and didn't turn around. Sometimes, in order to survive, you even need to escape from memory. After the empty house, Robert realized that staying in one place meant slowly disappearing. The city no longer held him. Every street reminded him of his loss, every courtyard of his silence. He collected a few things: rags, a tin cup, a knife without a handle. That was enough to get going. He didn't know where to go. You didn't have to know. The road stretched like a gray ribbon. There were people like him walking along it. Thin, silent, with the same look of people who already understood everything. They rarely greeted each other and hardly spoke. Words were wasting my strength. Sometimes someone fell down and did not get up. The others avoided him, not speeding up their pace. Death on the road did not slow down the movement. Robert slept by the campfires at night, if he could find firewood. The fire was weak, but alive. He reminded me that warmth still exists. At such times, Robert found himself staring at the flame for too long, as if trying to memorize its shape in case he never saw it again. Food was rarely found. Sometimes by giving. Sometimes it's a casual job, moving, digging, keeping watch. The pay was meager, but fair. Robert ate slowly, hiding every mouthful inside, as if he was afraid that it might be taken away even after it was swallowed. The road changed him. My thoughts became shorter, my feelings quieter. He stopped asking questions. The why disappeared first. All that remains is next. Every day began with that word and ended with it. Sometimes Robert thought of home. Not specific things, but a feeling. Warmth, which was once the norm. Those memories were dangerous. They were making their steps harder. Then he would chase them away and look at his feet. He didn't survive because he hoped, but because he kept walking. The road promised no salvation. She only gave movement, and that was enough. The years passed unnoticed, not because they were fast, but because Robert stopped counting them. At some point, he realized that he no longer felt hungry the way he used to. The body has learned to live in constant shortage, and the mind has learned not to wait. It was like a scar. It no longer hurt, but it reminded me of myself with every movement. Robert settled in a small village. I worked wherever I was hired. I ate what I was given. He did not complain or thank. Both feelings seemed superfluous to him. Sometimes in the evenings he would sit by the window and watch the sky darken. In those moments, the memories returned. Not all at once, not all at once. They came in fragments. The smell of bread, the mother's voice, the creak of floorboards. Robert allowed them to be, but not for long. Looking back too long made it difficult to breathe. The people around lived on. They had children, conversations, and plans. Robert listened to them and understood. For them, hunger is a story. For him, it's a part of the body. He didn't try to explain. Words still wouldn't convey the taste of the earth, the heaviness of queues, the silence of courtyards. Sometimes he dreamed of those who did not survive. They didn't say anything. We were just watching. Robert woke up and lay motionless for a long time, listening to his breathing. As long as he was breathing, He had to remember. It took him a while to realize this, but it was clear his survival was not a reward. It was a responsibility. The responsibility to remember for those who could not. Don't talk loudly. Don't blame. Just don't forget. Robert knew that hunger does not end when there is food. It ends when it is no longer remembered. As long as the memory is alive, those who left are also alive. He closed his eyes and for the first time in a long time allowed himself not to be afraid of silence.